Welcome to the Permaculture Practical Series for our Permaculture Design course. Today we're going to be working with worms and show you our worm farm. We're going to show you the different products that we can harvest from our worm farms. There's multiple products such as worm castings. We can take our worm castings to make bio balls, which we'll show you. We'll show you how to take worm castings to make like a long-term fertilizer for indoor plants or orchids if you have an orchid farm. We'll also show you how to feed your worms, how to separate your worms if you want to repopulate your worms, how to start your worm farm. Basically everything you need to be able to grow your worms and process them. What they eat, how they like to live, what kind of moisture they like, and how to do that. I started our worm farm here at Raktamachat 2 years ago. I went to a Thai farm. I asked that they had worms. I said, can I have some? The guy gave me a handful of worms about this big in a Ziploc bag. Okay, so here's your bag. Thank you. I brought them home. I set up one ring and I started to feed them. Worms are super interesting. One worm or whatever amount, so let's say one handful, every 3 months they double their population as long as you keep the right conditions and keep food supply equal to their population. Worms are said to be able to eat their body weight per day in food matter. So if I had like 1 kilo of worms to start with, after 3 months, I'd have 2 kilos. In 6 months, I have 4 kilos, and then that's an exponential growth rate, and then they can eat that per day. So the more you feed, the more they eat, up until whatever amount that you want to feed. So that's up to your food source or your needs of their products. Okay, so about 2 years later we doubled them. So it took about 6 months till I had filled up this first bin, and I filled the bin up with castings. Okay, so I was harvesting some castings, which I'll show, and I left some for them to grow. And I would feed, harvest, and the population increased. Finally, this bin was full. So it's full of worms. So what I do is I'm going to half that bin. So I'll show you later. We would half the bin and then make another bin. So I'd end up taking half the worms, put it here, feed them till they're both full. Approximately not 6 months, but another 3 months because they're getting doubled. At which time, those two make 2 more. Month and a half later, boom, 4. And all of a sudden, you get within a 2-year period of we'll see, I don't push my worms very much because we get lots of castings. And then it's enough for what we do in our gardens. But castings are super interesting. If I reach down and I pull off this and I look at the little bitty things, which look like little poo, right? Well, it is poo. It's worm poo. So the worm is eating we feed our manure from our cows. We put in the manure. The manure is very palatable to a worm. They like it. That's what they eat in nature. They come up and they'll screw this. So this is in the industry referred to, or the worm industry, as black gold. So the people that make worm farms, they're like, wow. In the U.S., England, around the world, this would be about $10, 10 pounds because of exchange rates. 10 pounds, $10 per kilo. So every kilo of this I sell for $10. The question is, how many kilos did it take of manure to turn into 1 kilo of worm castings? Our farm gets about 2 to 1. Different people, depending on what they feed in different ways, get different results. So about 2 kilos of manure, I can get 1 kilo of worm castings, which is pretty decent. So it's condensing this on like a trophic level. It's condensing down the manures. So at this point, we sell castings. If you're going to sell castings, you need to be careful. Or if you're going to buy castings, you buy dry castings. So these are wet right now. So if I was to, and castings hold water really, really well. So that when we put them in our soils, they even help to maintain the water level. Okay, good moisture. So at this point, this is heavy. Okay, but if I dry it, it's going to be lighter. So we want to dry castings. Okay. Castings are interesting. There's manure there, but there's also worm eggs, and they're really almost microscopic. You can't really see them. But there's worm eggs in there also. So if I just take these castings and I put them into like a potted plant, I water it, it has compost, the eggs will hatch, and then they will grow. After 3 months, they're at breeding size. They can breed, and then they'll keep doubling their population equal to the size and food supply. Okay? If there's no food supply, the breeders will die. Almost basically be assimilated back into the soil in which they live. They just like dissolve. Other microorganisms within the soil would eat their bodies. And the eggs sit there waiting for the right conditions. The conditions can either be moisture and food. So even if it's moisture, they may not hatch because there's no food. When a worm is born, it's born into its food source typically, and then it develops to eat that particular food source. So if you and then it doesn't really like to eat other things, and then its eggs could be born into a different food source and then be developed to eat that. So they don't like to be moved, and sometimes that's a problem when we buy worms from like a worm farm and we don't know what they were feeding it, and then we bring it home and we feed it something slightly different. Then those mature worms don't do as well at the beginning. They kind of like don't like that food. They don't adjust well, and they may even die off. But their castings and their eggs, right, then will be born into the particular food source. So if we keep feeding, even though we have a slight dieback at the beginning, if we are feeding different food source, the offspring will be born into our food source, and they'll be assimilated to eating that well. They will grow up, have 3 months later have offspring again, which are assimilated into that food source, and then your populations will start to increase. So that also means that if you can only get worm castings, you could start theoretically your worm farm just by utilizing only worm castings. And that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to show you that we take only our worm castings, we put it into our potting mixes, we use it within our garden, and we'll go find a pot over here that's been here for a while, open it up, take the plant out, look in the bottom, and we'll be able to see that baby worms have hatched and are growing into that pot. When we go to transplant that into our garden and or broad scale, then those worms are assimilated to move to that area. Then their offspring will assimilate to eat that kind of underneath that particular tree, basically the leaf fall of that tree. Okay, so
what is the variety of that worm?
right now, when I first started, I had both what you would call an earthworms and composting worms. And sometimes there's a misnomer between those two. Composting typically says it's a shallow worm, a worm that would like be on the top of the soil, and they tend to eat more fresher things, or even green, not say green, but a worm won't eat living things. So if there's like a living plant and I plant it here, or I plant a seed, the seedling will grow up in the worm bin, the roots will come down, and the worms don't eat that. If they did, they'd kill it, and then it wouldn't be able to grow up to drop the food source. So they don't kill their own food source, right? Similar to a fungi could eat anything. They're all teeth, right? But they don't eat living plants. They facilitate feeding the plant to grow up, and when the plant dies, they eat it at its death. Similar to the worm wants to eat its food source when it dies. They don't kill it. Okay, it's a much different concept. So they grow it up, eat it at maturity. Very rarely, and a lot of times in nature, we eat our plants young, right? Hardly ever do you have a vegetable that ever would be mature. So at this point, the worms are there. They can hear us, and they respond to vibrations. And so also talking, they're kind of what's going on. And then, but if I go to touch it, also they're going to say, hey, what's going on? Like for instance, a chicken is scratching, and he wants to eat me. Or particularly my son Joey likes to come in here and steal my worms. So he easily in 5 minutes can get like a kilo in a bucket and come say, oh, look, I got all your worms, Dad. Thanks. That's okay. So what we're going to do, we'll come over here. I'm going to take down the net. We keep the net here. It keeps out the chickens because we have free range chickens, and obviously if they can get in, they'll like to come and scratch the worms. So what we're going to do is simulate we're going to be a chicken, because I want to get the castings. I don't want to get my worms. I want my worms to stay. And one thing I want to say is that right now, today, Deer, because she was going on with her family on a holiday, she watered the worms because she's going to be gone for a couple days because she takes care of the nursery. So that's good, but if she would have communicated a little bit more with me, it probably would have been better if we're going to harvest our castings not to have watered them, because then they get like stuck together and it's a little bit more, say, work to get them out. If she had not watered it, they would be drier and it's easier to drag them out. Okay, so typically if you're going to be harvesting your castings, don't water them first. No reason to do that. So here we go. I'm going to go over here. Like this one, for instance, is quite a lot of water dripping there because she's probably watering the plants more than this area, but that's fine. Worms, first step, like a moisture condition of 75% water. Okay, by volume. So that's actually, if we want to do a water test, if we grab soils like we do with our natural building, if we grab this clay and we squeeze it and it'll drip, like drops come out, to have drip out, that's like 60. So it needs to be like a pretty decent drip. So if I was to grab a bunch of this soil and I want to have water dropping out. Yeah? So that's going to give me that that's above 60 to 70, 75%. If I grab it and it's just like water, that's too wet. So worms liking to be within that moisture level, okay? So at this level, I can see this is all castings. And I'm making noise. I'm just lightly scraping them. And if I scrape too much, I'll see, oh, there's a worm. He hasn't got away yet. So if I scrape quickly, here's that worm. Oh, there he goes. And it looks like it moved really fast, like, but what happened? Actually, the worm is in a hole, okay? And he's stretched out in the hole. And then when you scratch, he goes, oh, wow, and he shrinks back. It doesn't actually, like say, for instance, slither. And he shrinks himself back so that get away from that. So sometimes the worms are horizontally like this, especially if it's in a worm farm with nice conditions. But in nature, they're typically coming up like this, and then when it goes straight down. So that particular worm, easy to catch, right? Because of the conditions here. So I'm making noise, I'm scraping, and I'm kind of pulling to this level where I see the worms at, right? And you see it's more compacted at that level. So that's kind of like the compaction level. So this is giving me what I'm going to harvest. And if you don't want to use your hands, you could use a trowel, a rake. You don't have to touch them, okay? But this is not dirty. Worm castings don't carry pathogens that hurt humans in any way. I don't know. I think you could eat it and probably not get sick, but who wants to eat that anyway, okay? But you're not going to get sick from doing this or anything. So I go to this side. And this would be easier if it wasn't as wet. It's easier to drag, okay? And we probably could have harvested a little bit extra. But that's no problem. I can come back tomorrow and it'll be drier and I can harvest more if I want. So now I have basically pulled off the top of that bin what'll end up being about a kilo, maybe 1.5 kilos. And if I do get a nice worm or something like that, so this worm's probably about 2 months old. In another month, it'll be at breeding size, which would be about double this size. So it'll double its size. And then what'll end up happening if I know it's breeding, there's a ring here at its head. That ring will basically get fat, turn clearer to whitish, and then the eggs will be inside the little ring. The worm will find another mate. They'll entangle themselves in like a knot. And then they'll stay like that for a while, breed, at which time the eggs will be left into here. So there's definitely worm eggs within there. So I get this one, I'll put it in the wheelbarrow in a second. I can move over to this bin. And also while I'm doing this, I can kind of look like sometimes like this is not castings. That's the manure, the cow poo that hasn't been eaten properly. More than likely it's because it was really dense and it didn't get as wet. So it's harder for them to eat that. So they're gonna eat the easy thing first, the harder thing second. If someone puts in something like bamboo, or a piece of something that was in there, it's fine. But this is really hard, and again, they're gonna eat the easy stuff, and they're gonna leave this alone. Eventually, if there was no food, they'd go and eat this. But typically, they're not gonna wanna eat those things. You know, sometimes that's not so good.
Can you put a fresh manure in there? Or
Yeah, we're gonna do that in a second. So first step, we wanna harvest out our castings that we've produced this month. I only feed my worms once a month because I have so many now that feeding them once a month provides all the worm castings that we need. If I was to sell them, I actually probably could increase the production of these bins by 4. Feed them once a week. They will hold more capacity of worms per bin at their maximum capacity. Probably could produce, I don't know, say 2 kilos per week or 8 kilos of worm castings a month.
one bin?
About something like that if it's really going well and I'm taking care of it properly. Times 10 bins, so that's not bad, times $10. $10 is the retail price. So I may have to then go to someone at the farmer's market unless I want to sell directly. I might say, oh look, I'll sell them to you for $5 if you'll buy all of mine, and then I don't have to do anything. Or I could try to sell them directly for more. I could sell them through the internet, farmers markets. You could also go to like organic growers, people that have flower shops, things like this, and say, hey, would you sell my product? So that's kind of food. I'll put it back, and I'll do this, okay? So again, about another dry weight, 2 kilos. 2 kilos of castings, we have to weigh it later. Okay, so, and I go ahead and I do that for all the bins. And now here, you can see this castings are really big, right? Look how big that is, the big poo, right? That's probably an indication that somewhere there's a big worm, right? So he's probably the big daddy, and he's making larger poos. So I'm gonna maybe go down into here, see if we can find him. Yeah, so a bigger one. Again, we can see the whitish. So at a breeding, worms are hermaphrodites, so they're both male and female at the same time, but they do breed together. So, you know, as we go down, these are basically pure castings, okay, all the way down, that they're living in, and then they're eating the food source on top. So if I want to, I can dry this. So if I want to get the worms out, the style that I do, and it's not the only way that people do it. Sometimes people make machines or apparatuses on the internet. They put their castings in, they spin it, and then basically the castings fall out and the worms stay in because the net is, okay? So you can do that. And for me, I find it easier to just put food on one side. So if I want to half this bin to make a new bin, I'll just put food on this side and water it. And the worms on this side will go to get to that food source. And after about a week, they'll all move over and be eating this food because there's no food here. And then I will dig this out, say halfway down. Once I've dug this out, right, I can either take it out to sell it, right? So that's what I would do if I want to sell it. Just move all my worms, stay here. Take out half of this. So in this instance, this bin probably has about 25 kilos of castings at $10. So currently these are all pretty full bins, so maybe there's $2,500 US worth of castings in here, and they're producing something in the range of 800 a month if you could. So you can make an income of 800 a month and still have a surplus, and then it's exponential. So then, well, too many worms, so I can start to sell worms. I can sell castings. I can also upcycle the product or upvalue the products, which I'll show you in a second. So I'll put those back. I don't really need them right now. Scrape these. If there's a worm, I'll put him back. The more noise that I'm making, they're all going down into their holes, so they go to the bottom. So then it's easier to, say, make castings. Maybe we could have a stereo and train them. Just turn on some heavy metal music, and they get used to going away. So do this. If 1 or 2 worms is inside when we put it in our potting mix, that's not a problem, because it's going to go in the garden anyway. But overall, we don't want to try to take the mature worms. We want to leave our breeders. So it's a good bin, quite a lot of castings. I'm coming right down to that hard layer, and you see the worm there vertically. He's laying at the hard layer and coming up. Here's a little baby, super, super small, or here's one. So in there, I ended up with a small baby worm. So I can put that one back, but if it went to the garden, again, no problem. Cool. So at this point, we go down, can scrape those, but as you're scraping them, move them into a wheelbarrow. So what we're going to end up with is, if we clean these out, we'll get about a full wheelbarrow full of castings, okay? That's pretty decent. Then I'll show you the next step. We're going to take those castings and how do we mix them at what ratio to our potting mix, okay? Depending on what we're planting, we're going to have a different ratio. These are super powerful, like really packed with what you want to call fertilization, NPK, much more than anything else. So if you actually put too much, like if I try to take pure castings and grow these, what'll end up happening is they'll have so much nutrition that once they later go in, they'll be like, man, I grew up and I had all this food and now I feel starving all the time. So we want to give them enough nutrition to grow well, but not so much as when they go in the garden, they think the garden has no food, right? So we want to get them a good start. We want to get them to the garden to harden up. And then at the end, we want to give them a good boost to make a mature plant set fruit. So that's kind of what we're going to look at. So depending on what we're going to grow, whether we're potting a tree, doing seedlings, we'll have a slightly different mix, okay? So we'll go into that in the next step. Okay, so let's get our wheelbarrow. And when I do this, if I happen to see a worm, I can always throw it back, right? So we go ahead, that's pretty decent for one bin, right? So we put in half a sack of manure per month, is about what I feed. That ends up with about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of manure covering this, and I'll show you how to do that, how to wet it, because they like to eat soft foods. They convert that into here, so half a sack turns into about 1/4 sack, or densifies by about half. 1 sack of manure cost me 10 baht to buy in the village, okay? So a value of 10 baht. And then so if half a sack per bin is 5 baht. So I put in 5 baht and I take out $20.
$20.
See, that's not bad. But it's not like that, because in Thailand, the castings are not worth $10 because of the exchange, right? So how much would a Thai person pay for castings? So if I go to CQ, which is our closest town, they sell worm castings. 1 kilo is 60 baht, or $2. So 5 baht turns into 60 baht. The thing about worms is you want to have a good worm farm and you would like to be commercial. The major thing is, where does the resource, the input come? So we know the output, castings. What's the input? So this is a system. That's my biological resource, but it needs to be fed. So if I have an access to foods, food waste, whether that may be coffee shop that lives nearby, I can get their coffee waste. Or maybe there's a brewery, I can get brewery waste. Or maybe there's a university and they have lots of food in the canteen, and could I get that food waste, okay? And if I have access on a consistent basis to X amount of food waste, any organics, I can condition my worms to eat that. At which time they take a low value product and turn it into a higher value product. And even at this value, this is the value of just a raw material. I can then upcycle this value again. So we can go and later show you how to make even more valuable or marketable products from this.